Welcome to Bible study on the Hebrew text or the Old Testament text, Nahum. Nahum is one of the shortest books of the Bible, and we're looking at it by linking to our study on the book of Jonah. So let's look first at a little bit of the background of Nahum. The title of it is about it being an oracle. Oracle means burden or a message of doom. But the technical term for the prophecy is of a nation under judgment. And we know from this prophecy that it is looking at the judgment of Nineveh. It's possible that you're thinking, we've looked at this in Jonah, and that's correct. However, in the book of Jonah, we were looking back in time to the destruction of Nineveh. This text was written around the time of the judgment of Nineveh, and so it carries the weight of being a text written at the time. It carries the weight of a text being written with a people understanding what was going on. And this speaks into prophetic texts. These prophetic texts were to be read and understood within the context of their own time. And this is something I'd like to stress as we explore this text today and in the future, of the desire we have to, and the importance we have of applying these texts to our current lives. And so my caution is to remember that these texts were written, given, prophesied in a way of existing at the same time. They were not intended to prophesy into the future. This is a text of a prophecy of the judgment of Nineveh, of a judgment of a particular nation. And so I know that some of us have had conversations about parallels in the modern world. And these are helpful and important reflections. These are important ways for us to explore current political situations and things that we see in our lives around us. But I would urge us to remember that this prophetic text was written about the nation of Nineveh for that time and for those people. You might be forgiven for not realizing initially that the text was about Nineveh. In fact, the reference to Nineveh does not occur until chapter 2, verse 8. So therefore we have a need of a little bit of advanced warning about what we are reading. So let's think about Nineveh. It was a heavily fortified city. It was on the banks of the river Tigris. It contained palaces and temples, particularly to Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. It ruled. It was a ruling part of the Assyrian Empire, and it was appropriately recognized as such. It had rich monuments, rich friezes, streets and gardens. Think of beautiful, expensive cities, and you won't be far wrong. So a little bit of historical context about the Assyrian Empire. In the mid-8th century BC, Assyria sent armies into Aram, which then spread into Judah and eventually into Egypt. These movements were interpreted as God's dealings with Israel and the nations. There are links through other Hebrew texts. For example, Isaiah. Assyria was a nation to be feared. It was a nation, a powerful nation, a long and violent empire that brought destruction to many of the nations around it. And so it might interest us, and we may find it helpful for our understanding of this text, to explore a little bit of the background of foreign prophecies, or prophecies that are against foreign nations. They were words or oracles of the prophets, and they were superseded. There were set texts that were superseded by the 5 books of the law, or the Torah. They were written by different prophets, but they had similar themes and directions. And where the text couldn't be grouped by date, they were grouped by motif or theme. So it's possible that Actually, this text links to the Jerusalem Royal Festival. There isn't much known about this festival, although evidence from the Psalms suggests that it was a week-long celebration. But what is thought to be a motif was something of the Day of the Lord, and it's a theme that is picked up here. Before the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests, things were delivered in more theological and religious terms rather than historical ones. But the theme is to look past judgment to salvation, and this is an undertone of Nahum. Yes, it speaks greatly of destruction, but it speaks of destruction because it points to the salvation of God's chosen people, a salvation that occurs and is accomplished by God's intervention on his people's behalf. And so this was a liturgical expansion of foreign prophecies. And what would occur was that priests of the temple and prophets were organised into guilds with the aim of preserving traditions and training people for temple functions. They would have had access to written form, though it was very much likely that it would be an oral form repeated and handed down. But within this, and we reference it, there is still that sense of speaking into a play, of creating drama and bringing it to the assembly. Assyrian power started waning in around 775 BC. As the power crumbled, Nineveh fell to the Babylonian and Median attack in the summer of 612 BC. So we can hear and see that this was a long fall, as indeed it had been a long and powerful nation. And it is at around this time that we find the Nahum prophecy written. It's a celebration of the fall, but its prophetic and historic character suggests that just before 614 BC, Assyrian's enemies allied against her. And so Nahum is an interpretation of the events. So yes, it is historical fact, but it is also an interpretation. It's possibly building on Isaiah's prediction of the limits of God's toleration of Assyrian power, of God's toleration of nations going against God's will. This prophetic text was written to be read or spoken in the temple before an assembly. And so when we look a little bit more deeply at the way it is broken down, keep this in mind, that it was to be delivered to a group of people, it was to be heard, and when you have this knowledge, you will hear the poetry that comes through this prophetic text. The text of Nahum is a vision record. It speaks into reason and time and space receding, and brings to the forefront a compulsion to speak and to see in a heightened consciousness from God, really exploring that relationship that the writer has with God. A reminder for us to explore the heightened relationship that we wish to have with God. And so, yes, this text is a poem. The first part sets the stage. It's about vengeance. The enemies are addressed, and there's a look to the hope for Israel. And it's set as an acrostic poem, a familiar feature of Hebrew texts, and we'll explore that a little bit as well. But I'd like to offer you the thought that although this was to be read or delivered in temple, actually rather than a text, there's the possibility that it should have been preached, or was more like a play script to be spoken and added to. And that brings with it a sense of drama, a sense of changes that can be made as the speaker addresses everybody in the temple. A way of bringing people in and making them a part of this story, and making them a part of this prophetic text. And so this makes it a much more living, exciting text. So although short, this is what we can bring to it. And perhaps when we think back to pantomime and being the audience and participating in that text, perhaps we need to remember to bring ourselves in this way to this ancient text as well. Chapter 1 is about the fall of Babylon, not about Nineveh. It is that scene setting, that reminder that takes us right back into Exodus, that the Lord is slow to anger, great in power, and does not leave evil unpunished. And we go right back in that language to the golden calf incident. It is that reminder that God throughout the ages does not allow violent nations to endure forever, that there is justice and retribution. It's a theme that we see in Daniel. It does have implications for us as we consider the war-torn, bipartisan world, as we consider a world torn apart by greed, with nations pitting themselves against one another for their own means. But we do need to take care of how we see ourselves and other nations within this prophetic poetry. This text is not a call to arms. It is not speaking to nationalism under the guise of Christianity. It's pointing to God as the bearer and judgment giver for all. It's speaking to God to act and react in accordance with the choices that we make for one another. And so I would urge a caution and a healthy respect for this text, that we remember to use it rightly and not for our own means. Chapter 1 speaks of messengers. It speaks of God speaking through messengers. And for comfort for Judah, that judgment will come for Nineveh's brutality and idolatry. We know this because it's speaking through the Babylonian fall, but about Nineveh. In verse 10, there's a reference to the stubble completely withered and dry. Think of this as fair and just. This is a fair and just God, a God who watches and sees his people and does not tolerate evil for eternity. We also see within creation, and the creation theme is strong through this chapter, we see that God's presence and power is far-reaching and all-encompassing. We hear that from Bashan on the east to Mount Carmel on the west, from east to west, from that whole distance, that God's power is there. We hear that God's power is present in God's creation in the natural world. We hear of the sea and his power over the sea, of the storm, drying up the rivers, the earthquakes, the blossoms, the mountains. All that creation language is threaded through this text, which is especially important for us, I think, to consider as we are doing this Bible study in Creation Tide, just before we are preparing to head into our Lenten preparations. There is a powerful appearance of God's glory in this text. It has similarities to the beginning of Micah and to the ending of Habakkuk. There is powerful creation comforting the nations, bringing God's justice. And the end of chapter 1 speaks into a familiar piece of language that we have. Behold on the mountains the feet of him who bring good news. And this good news was quite literally the good news of peace, as the text moves from the fall into the destruction and into the hope that we have in God. And so we move from the warning of those who deny God in chapter 1 into chapter 2, the overthrowing of Nineveh. And chapter 2 is a brutal portrayal of the battle for the city. It tells us of the fall, gives stark observations of the battle. It tells us the progressive stages of the Battle of Nineveh. the front line of the soldiers, the charge of the chariots, the chaos that occurred on the walls, the slaughter of Nineveh's people, and the plundering of the city. If you look in verse 11, it speaks of the den of lions, a direct reference, the lions being Assyria. How they tore enough, in verse 12, for the cubs, for the Assyrian citizens, that violent prey predator portrayal. And it brings us through that descriptive passage of war and violence to verse 13. Behold, I am against you, Nineveh. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. I will burn your chariots in the smoke, and the sword will devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the land, and the voice of your messengers will no longer be heard. And so it's the reality of the destruction of people. And this is something we need to remember if we're choosing to make parallels to modern policy and politics. Yes, it speaks into politics, but the reality is that it is speaking about people, about other human beings like we are, and about other human beings that we reference when we speak of evil done by nations and political movements. And so we are led into chapter 3, which references Nineveh's complete ruin, and being the capital of the Assyrian Empire, cornerstone if you like, it speaks into the results of the fall of the entire empire as a whole. There is injustice built into Assyria in its beginnings, in its initial building, but it is the violence that has brought about its destruction. So yes, there was injustice, yes, there was imperfection, but it is the violence that has brought the Assyrian nations, the Assyrian Empire and Nineveh to its downfall, to its complete destruction. And so this speaks into and gives us the opportunity to consider the implication of choices that we make and the intentions that we have of knowing that we are flawed and imperfect, but knowing that it is what we do with this and how we act with this and the results that can come from the choices that we continue to make. And we can choose to apply this in our lives. The text that we are reading is that historical prophetic text speaking into that time and that place of this particular fall, of this particular empire. But an important reminder that it wasn't the difficult beginnings that caused this, but rather the continued choices of destruction and violence. And so chapter 3 ends with a taunt to the fallen Assyrian king, a taunt that says, people clap at your fall. That realization that nobody comes to help, but rather celebrates the destruction. And so let us be mindful, if we are going to apply this to things that we see in the modern world, of how people view things and how we view things within our knowledge of God. And of course, we have a knowledge of God that is also delivered to us through the New Testament, through the loving nature of God who sent his Son for us. Often with other prophets, the language is that of the wrath of God on Israelites for their lack of obedience and therefore broken relationship with God. However, this is not what Nahum speaks into. Nahum speaks of the wrath of God on the adversaries of God's chosen people, of a vengeance, of comfort and consolation for God's people. And so this would have been found through the liturgy and through the worship in that festival, in that Royal Jerusalem festival. I hope you've enjoyed reading through Nahum and thinking about some of the themes and features of this text. I wonder how you have seen the poetry, or what it's made you think about creation in this creation tide season. I wonder what kind of parallels you have drawn between the people of this time and our time, and the way our nations behave and interact. And I wonder if it's given you room for thinking about the ways that we need to use texts carefully when we speak of God and God's commitment to us. And yet, in spite of all this, and because of it, we are reassured of the steadfastness of God and his love for his people. Do join us again.